So we treat diabetes with insulin. That's been the center of our treatment for type 1 diabetes. There have really not been any other, there is no other treatment for type 1 diabetes. And you've heard of the term dogma. Now the definition of dogma is it's a principle laid down by an authority to be intraconvertibly true, or absolutely true and not questionable. Now, how do you find new dogma? And I learned this at the medical school, that if you wanted to find new dogma, the answer is that you question old dogma. And so dogma sometimes does change over time, and that there is some dogma that was thought to be true may no longer be true. For example, the Earth was thought to be flat. That was unquestionable until someone sailed around the world. The Earth is the center of the universe, which I believe is no longer thought to be true. And the Chicago Cubs would never win the World Series. And boys are smarter than girls, and you know that's not quite true. And then there's even political dogma. And then there's even medical dogma. And the medical dogma is that type 1 diabetes is completely dependent on the use of the insulin, full stop, no other choice. But maybe not. So to set the stage, the center player in the problem with diabetes is the pancreas. And the pancreas is about 6 inches long. It varies with your height and your weight. And it's found behind your stomach. I'm going to show you a picture of that. And it has both digestive and endocrine function. Digestive meaning it helps you digest food, it produces enzymes that breaks food down, but it has another magical action on the endocrine system. And the liver is a close proximity to the pancreas because they communicate very, very closely, as you're going to see. And so here's the in blue is the pancreas. This is the bowel. This is the liver. The pancreas is actually sitting behind the stomach, in between the stomach and the spine. And this is a cartoon of the pancreas. This is the tail of the pancreas, which has got more islets of Langerhans in it. And this is the head of the pancreas. This is the pancreatic duct. And all the digestive juices that the pancreas produce come down here and they join in with the bile duct and they empty into the duodenum. So when you're eating a meal, as you just did, you're going to need some help from some digestive enzymes. And that pancreas, right now as we're sitting here talking, is busy working and is also producing some alkali to neutralize some of the acid that is being produced in your stomach. And this one didn't turn out very well, this picture didn't copy well, but it gives you an idea. This is the duct that will contain this digestive juice, and they're coming from these glands that make the digestive juice, and they're emptying in these tubes. But then there's these islets of Langerhans, which I'm going to show you better than this in a minute, that are sprinkled around the pancreas. So I want to tell you about Paul Langerhans. Everybody's heard about the islets of Langerhans? Well, it is named after this guy, Paul Langerhans. Now, who was he? He was a medical student in 1869 who wrote a paper as a medical student, Contributions to the Anatomy of the Abdominal Salivary Gland. That's what the pancreas was. He thought it was a salivary gland. It is a salivary gland. That's the exocrine portion of it. And that was his article. And he described something that nobody had seen before. And he found that there were islands of clear-looking cells throughout the gland. And he didn't really know what they were. He hypothesized that they were actually lymph nodes. But in no way did he tie it to insulin. That took years and years for that to be discovered. And when he died, he had no idea how famous he was going to be, because every medical student or anybody who studies medicine knows that these are called the islets of Langerhans after his observation. This is Paul. This is when he was a young man. This is when he makes his discoveries. If you're going to make discoveries, it's good to be apparently in your 20s and your 30s. And but he died a young man. He died at age 41. He died of kidney failure and tuberculosis. So in the islets of Langerhans, there are about between 1 and 3 million of these sprinkled through the pancreas. They're very small. They're 0.1 millimeters in diameter. That's why nobody had seen them before. There are about 3,000 to 4,000 cells in each islet. Their combined mass is only 2 grams, and there are 5 distinct cells in each islet. So the dominant cell is the beta cell. That's our primary player, because in type 1 diabetes, your immune system has chosen wrongly to destroy the beta cells. I saw a 9-year-old boy today who just developed diabetes. His father has diabetes, his uncle has diabetes, his cousin has type 1 diabetes, and somewhere in the last few weeks, his immune system finished off his beta cells, and he now has diabetes. He's been starting on insulin at 1 o'clock today. So the beta cell actually makes a second hormone. It's co-secreted with insulin called amylin, and amylin was actually is available. It's used for treating diabetes. Not very good, but it's not very popular. I thought it was going to be very popular, but it hasn't turned out to be too popular. The other dominant cell that is found in the islets of Langerhans is the alpha cell. And the alpha cell and glucagon is what made Dr. Unger famous. Before Dr. Unger's work, people couldn't measure glucagon, but because of the kind work of a particular rabbit that he has stuffed in his office, he was able to develop an antibody test that allowed you to measure glucagon, and much of his life has been spent studying glucagon. There are other cells, such as the delta cell that produces somatostatin, and several other ones. Ghrelin plays a role in appetite regulation. But the key point I want to make is that the alpha and the beta cell are in close proximity. I'll demonstrate that for you. They're neighbors. So here's a cartoon of an islet of Langerhans. This happens to be likely from a rodent, because I can tell from its architecture that around the outside are the alpha cells in pink. They tend to be in rodents in this periphery of the islet. The main cell making up the bulk of the islet of Langerhans is the beta cell. Also as shown here is some delta cells which produce somatostatin. And here is this is an islet of Langerhans right here. All of this is sea of other cells are producing digestive enzymes. 98% of the pancreas is making digestive enzyme. And this is another close-up view of an islet of Langerhans. And this is an islet of Langerhans that's not so round. It's closer to the head of the pancreas. Okay, so here I told you architecturally the islets are a little bit different between humans and the mouse. Here the alpha cells producing glucagon are found in the periphery. These are human islets. You'll see the alpha cells tend to be in the periphery, but they're also commingled into the islet. So they're a little anatomically a little different between the human and the mouse, and that may be relevant. So the history of diabetes was changed in 1921 when Banting decided that he knew how to isolate insulin. Everybody knew insulin had to be there. The problem is nobody could get it. And it's the whole story. I'd love to give this whole story. Dr. Unger tells a good story, but I even know it better than he does. And but I don't have the time to do that right now. But he got a hold of this fellow here who was just entering medical school, and he had me for a summer project, and they decided to go out and isolate insulin, and they were successful. And this is Marjorie, who was the first dog to get insulin. They actually injected it into themselves too. And then they decided that they got a hold of this guy, Collop, who really knew what he was doing to purify their mixture. And at the University of Toronto, they decided it was time to treat a diabetic. So they went over to the teaching hospital, the Toronto General, where I did my residency. And they got a hold, or they heard about this guy who was dying. His name was Leonard Thompson. He was in ketoacidosis. And they requested permission to give him insulin, their magical new substance that had not been tested really formally. And he was turned down. I don't know if you knew that. He was turned down because he didn't have privileges. at the hospital, and you know hospitals as they are. They wouldn't give him, so they actually convinced an attending physician to go ahead and give him the injection. And guess what? He got better and better, and he got out of the ketoacidosis, lived, and he lived for 12 years. And the only reason why he only lived for 12 years was because he ultimately died in a motorcycle accident. Because otherwise he hopefully would have lived much longer than that. So that's Leonard Thompson. So if anybody is living without hope, then thinking about Leonard Thompson is motivational, that you never know what the next day can bring. So once insulin was isolated, it was very important to increase production. The University of Toronto and Connaught Lab joined hands with the Eli Lilly company to dramatically increase production of insulin. The pancreases are poured in here. They're ultimately purified and put in vials. And within a short time, the world was able to get a hold of insulin. So this is one of the early vials of insulin from the Connaught Lab. You'll notice that this has 10 units per cc. So if you wanted to give 10 units of insulin, you had to inject 1 cc of this mixture. And you'll see on the word here, it says Toronto, University of Toronto and Toronto. When I went to school, and in Canada still, I'm sure, this insulin is called Toronto. So when I moved here, and one of the first patients I saw had high blood sugar, and I told the nurse, give them 10 units of Toronto. She said, what are you talking about? And I said, give them 10 units of Toronto. And they said, I still don't know what you're talking about. So I said, you don't? And I said, well, give them 10 units of regular. Which is what, I don't even know where the word regular came from. I don't know if you know where the word, I don't know where the word regular came from. But where I came from, it was Toronto. And Lilly's product was called Islatin, which is actually the name preferred by Banting and Best, referring back to the islets. This contained only 5 units per cc. So if you wanted to give 5 units of insulin, you had to give a 1 cc injection. It also says shake the vial, interestingly. So it must have had some other impurities. So insulin results were miraculous. They reversed ketoacidosis. They prevented death. The alternative, if you developed type 1 diabetes prior to the discovery of insulin, your life expectancy on average was 90 days. It was exactly the same as the death sentence. There was another alternative. Now, what they ultimately figured out was you could live longer by starving patients if you restricted carbohydrates severely. You could stretch somebody's life out for about 2 or 3 years, but it was a slow death through starvation. And a lot of the people who first got insulin were being starved to death. And then if you got the insulin, it would provide a near normal life for decades. There's been dramatic progress in the production of insulin. We have far better insulins. We're no longer dependent on animal sources. The insulin is manufactured in yeast and bacteria. The long-acting insulins we have are very good now. There's all these choices: Lantus, Toujeo, Basaglar, Tresiba, Levemir. Tresiba is the newest long-acting insulin around. We have good short-acting insulins: Humalog, Novolog, Apidra. And now in the near future, we may have some ultra-short-acting insulins. Insulin is going to be mixed with a vasodilator, which will allow insulin to get absorbed and may be available later this year. We have inhaled insulin, who were the sponsors for tonight's dinner, and they have a product called Afrezza, and they claim that, and it is true, that this insulin works faster, goes through the lungs, and has a shorter duration, and for some people this is a benefit. One of the great progresses is the needle. The needles used to be huge. Give insulin, painful, they had to be boiled. I had a grandfather with type 1 diabetes. I remember him boiling his needles. And we have pens. A lot of people prefer to get insulin with pens. We have pumps: Omnipod, Medtronic, Animas, T-Slim. There's disposable pumps, Vigo. And there's a hybrid artificial pancreas coming out in May by Medtronic, which will have a sensor pump, and the pump will deliver all varying doses of insulin depending on the blood sugar. It's very important that that sensor do a good job, and I hope Medtronic has improved their sensor, because I've been disappointed with their last generation of sensor. But they promised to me that it will be a better sensor. This is one of my patients I saw yesterday. I thought that was the look of diabetes today. She's wearing, in this case, she's wearing an Omnipod insulin pump, and she has a Dexcom sensor. But even with all that, unfortunately, her hemoglobin A1C was only 7.6, so she could do even better. She's a nurse, not nurse, she's a flight attendant on Southwest Airlines. And however, the problem with all of this is that no one still achieves completely normalization of the blood sugars. We have all these tools, all these wonderful insulin, but nobody really gets their blood sugar perfectly back to normal. The use of glucose sensors have been enormously helpful. I think a sensor is much more valuable to me than a pump. And, but it not only helps with the administration of insulin, but it also reveals to us what kind of poor diabetic control most patients are in. We see very dramatic change of blood sugar when we're using these sensors, but they're here to stay, and they are helpful. And this new one, Libre, will be available, we think, in the next couple of months. We know that people's diabetes seems to be easier when they first get diabetes, to look after them. Some people go into what is called a honeymoon, and they're relatively easy to control. And then as people go longer and longer, the diabetes gets harder to control their blood sugar. And insulin treatment alone so far has not been able to restore, as they say, glucose homeostasis. So I just saw a patient who was doing quite well today, or yesterday. No, I got this out today. And he's wearing a Libre sensor. And you can see that his blood sugar, this is 2 weeks of data superimposed on each other, and his blood sugar comes down quite well through the night. But look what happens every time he eats a meal. The blood sugars go up to 250. And so he's not as well controlled. But if he only checks his blood sugar like before meals, he can be thinking things are just great. The blood sugars are good. But what happens after the meal? It may turn out that diabetic complications are more tied to postprandial blood sugars than the fasting blood sugars. So this is a reminder, by the way, this device estimates from the blood sugar that the hemoglobin A1C should be about 7.4%. So even with optimally controlled diabetic controls, or what we think is optimally controlled, there is great volatility in the blood sugar control. The blood sugars go up to over 400, they go down below 40. The hemoglobin A1C may be pretty good, but it rarely goes to what we call normal, which is 5.6% or less. And therefore, overall, if you take most diabetic, we can reduce complications by about 50%, but we aren't happy with 50%. We want 100% reduction in complications. So no matter how insulin is formulated, administered, time, normal glucose levels, as of this day, cannot be achieved. So why is insulin not working? What's the failure? What's wrong with insulin? So you have to understand the anatomy of the islet of Langerhans. And the key point is that they have this alpha cell and the beta cell that are neighbors. They're sitting beside each other. The alpha cell produces glucagon, the beta cell produces insulin. And these two hormones work in an opposing effect. The insulin promotes glucose utilization. When you ate your meal, took your insulin, or produced your insulin, your body wants to store that energy. On the other hand, if you haven't eaten, you fasted, your brain, your central nervous system requires glucose in a continuous manner. Where's it going to go? It goes to the glucose bank, which is your liver. And the liver listens to the command of glucagon and puts out more glucose. The problem with diabetes is if you don't regulate the liver overproduces glucose. When diabetics say to me, yes, but I went to bed and my blood sugar was 100 when I went to bed, I wake up it's 250, I didn't have a Hostess Twinkie in the middle of the night, what happened? Well, what happened was that glucose came to the liver. It was unregulated, it overproduced glucose, and if you can only restrain the liver, you can do a lot to keep your blood sugar normal. The primary action of both hormones takes place in the liver. The liver is the kingpin in deciding what your blood sugar is going to be. And I want to remind you that the pancreas and the liver are connected by what is called the portal vein. And to show you what that looks like here, this is the liver, which is to me like General Motors. It does most things in your body. It's a factory that makes things. And all this is your guts. So you have your esophagus, your stomach, you have your duodenum, you have your large bowel, your small bowel. And you notice all of this is drained by veins. And where do the veins go? They all come together right here. That coming together is called the portal vein. It comes together when this major vein, which is called the superior mesenteric vein, comes and joins with the splenic vein. And together they form the portal circulation. Here's the pancreas right over here. It's separated to show you the anatomy, but normally, of course, it's connected. And it drains into the splenic vein, and the splenic vein goes right into the portal vein, which goes right into the liver. When the pancreas speaks, the liver is listening. So, the beta cell is an amazing cell, and it is very perceptive and sensitive and to the nutrients that are being absorbed. And when you eat a meal and your blood sugar rises, it causes insulin to be released from the beta cell. Beta cell recognizes it and puts out insulin. Now, where is the highest this is something you've never thought about before. Where is the highest concentration of insulin in your body? And the answer is the highest concentration of insulin is found within the islet. Within the islet, and this fluid bathes the alpha cell. Remember, they're neighbors. The beta cell secretes insulin, and it influences the alpha cell, that is its immediate neighbor. The alpha cell produces glucagon. The insulin then suppresses the secretion of glucagon. When you eat a meal and your insulin level rises, the first thing that happens, it goes to its neighbor and says, we don't need you right now, go to sleep, and glucagon is suppressed. So here is an electron microscopic view of the anatomy of the islet cell. Here is the alpha cell. Who's his neighbor? Beta cells. There's usually a group of beta cells surrounding or close to the alpha cell. Now we can even identify the hormone. In this case, these large granules are glucagon, and these smaller granules are insulin. And when this releases insulin, it does it such a way that it has an immediate effect on the alpha cell. And we call this a paracrine effect. Normally we think of endocrine as a gland that produces a hormone that has an effect somewhere else. It has to be dumped into the bloodstream to have an effect. An exocrine gland dumps it into a duct, and then it has an effect. Not into a blood vessel, to a duct. But paracrine means cell to cell. These two cells are talking to each other. And if you talk to the alpha cell in such a way, the alpha cell can be suppressed. Okay, so the liver receives the right mixture of these hormones. And what it listens to is what's called the insulin-glucagon ratio. When the ratio is increased, that means you've got insulin going up, glucagon going down. That's the message for the liver to store energy. When the opposite is true, there's a decreased insulin-glucagon ratio, like when you're fasting, it tells the liver to release glucose because you need glucose. If you didn't have glucose, a normal person would go to bed at night and would be dead the next morning because his brain and the central nervous system can only use one source of energy, which is glucose. So it's got to come from somewhere, and it comes from the liver. And the way it works, it has to do with this ratio of insulin to glucagon. Therefore, there is a bihormonal partnership between these two that's regulating nutrients within a very narrow range. Ooh. Okay. What's the problem with the current use of insulin? This is the key point of the night. When we inject insulin, do we inject insulin into the portal vein? It's a tough injection. We inject insulin into the subcutaneous tissue. This takes time to be absorbed, depending on what kind of insulin you inject. But even at best, it's going to start to work in 15 minutes, won't peak for 90 minutes unless you use inhaled insulin, which beats it. Every tissue in your body then receives insulin at the same concentration. It's spread out equally throughout your body. Now, this is to compare it against endogenously secreted insulin. If you're not diabetic, then you secrete insulin in a concentration that is 400 times higher in the islets of Langerhans. And if you look at its concentration in the portal vein going into the liver, it's at least 100 times higher than it is in the periphery. So let's look at it diagrammatically. Here is the normal individual. This individual just ate a meal. The beta cell is secreting insulin. Insulin is shown in red. The concentration is high, 4,000. It is telling the alpha cell to go to sleep. The amount of glucagon that is therefore released is very little. The next place where the insulin concentration is the greatest is in the portal circulation. Here's the portal circulation. It's bathing the liver. There's a high concentration, not quite as high as in the beta cell, in the islets of Langerhans, but high. And most of that insulin is used up, burned away, before it gets into the systemic circulation. This is the amount of insulin that is found in the systemic circulation. It's still enough to act on your muscle and your fat cells, but not too much of it, versus the alternative, your way of taking insulin. Insulin is injected. The concentration of insulin is maximum where you don't need it. It's in the periphery. When you look at the amount of insulin in the islets of Langerhans, it's not there. Therefore, that cell, the alpha cell, is unregulated. When it's unregulated, it's going to pour out glucagon. The glucagon is going to be telling the liver to release glucose, just when you don't need it to. So you've got too much insulin in the periphery, which predisposes you to low blood sugar. You have an unregulated alpha cell that is allowing glucagon to be released inappropriately. So the fate, all right. Subcutaneous injected insulin, let's summarize. It fails to reach paracrine levels of insulin, that is, the amount of insulin that's inside the islet. Therefore, glucagon continues to be secreted at high levels. We don't want that. The excess and inappropriate hyperglucagonemia is the main cause of hyperglycemia. It's not so much the food you ate, it's your liver listening to glucagon that's causing the high blood sugar. And when you give increasing doses of subcutaneous insulin, you cannot approach in any way possible the normal paracrine levels of insulin in the islet that is required to suppress glucagon. You cannot suppress glucagon with injection of insulin. And as you try to do that and increase the insulin, you're going to cause hypoglycemia in the periphery. Are there any other ways to suppress glucagon? It would seem that it would be reasonable to try to suppress glucagon. And the answer is yes. There is a substance called leptin, which can suppress the action of glucagon in type 1 diabetic rodents. This has been demonstrated, as I will show you. There's another drug. We mentioned a third cell in the islet of Langerhans that is called somatostatin. It can suppress both insulin and glucagon. And most important player is going to be, we think, the glucagon receptor antibody. We can raise antibodies that are directed very specifically today to do the function that you want it to do. And you can raise an antibody that recognizes a receptor. So you may have a hormone, but if that hormone cannot get to the receptor, that hormone has no action. You can block the action of the hormone. And such a product exists. Now, leptin, which I don't want to talk about too much, which comes from the word Greek, means thin, and it plays a role in satiety, and is a very important role, and is produced in fat cells, but it has another action, and that action is that it can antagonize the action of glucagon on the liver. So that sounds good. Has it ever been used? Yes, it's been used in mice who were infused a form of leptin called metroleptin, and a study was done looking at these mice who were treated with insulin who are in black. So here they are, here's 14 days, and these mice are giving insulin, and you see what happens when they get insulin. Their blood sugar drops, goes right back, goes up, goes down. It's a roller coaster of blood sugars. Or you use metroleptin that blocks glucagon, and they're shown in squares, open squares. And they're given a subcutaneous infusion, so these mice have got pumps on, and they're getting it infused. Leptin is being infused. It can't be given orally. It doesn't work as a single injection. And look what happens to the blood sugars. They come down, and as long as you provide glucagon suppression with somatostatin, the blood sugars normalize. Here's another substance, somatostatin. This is given by an intravenous infusion. This is humans. And in this study, which goes on for 7 days, patients are given insulin. So this box is showing you that insulin is being given for the full 7 days. After day 3, somatostatin is given, which is going to block glucagon. And then in those 2 last remaining days, they add back some glucagon. So let's see what happens. In the beginning, their diabetes is not well controlled on insulin. The blood sugars are elevated. If you look at their glucagon level, it's elevated. And if you look at glucose excretion in the urine, there's lots of glucose in the urine. They have uncontrolled diabetes. They're given somatostatin. What does somatostatin do to glucagon? The glucagon, which was elevated, now becomes suppressed. And what happens to the glucose level? They just about completely normalize. And then, when you add back glucagon, and the glucagon level rises, the blood sugar rises. So while they suppress glucagon way down here, the blood sugars normalize. But these people, humans, were on an infusion, intravenous continuous infusion of somatostatin. Now, there is a product called REMD 477. What is that? That is an antibody directed at blocking glucagon. Now, I'm going to show you some mice that are untreated. These are the blood sugars. And when you don't treat a mouse who's got diabetes with anything, nothing much happens with the blood sugar. It stays elevated. Over here are 2 different kinds of mice. The first mouse, which is showed in squares, black squares, are type 2 mice. They are called EBDB mice, and they are raised to have type 2 diabetes. And then in triangles are mice that have been given a drug that caused them to have type 1 diabetes. And each one of these represents, I believe, 6 mice. And in both cases, those that had type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes, as soon as they're given the glucagon inhibitor, blocker, the blood sugar came down into the normal range and stayed there and did not develop hypoglycemia. And these mice have been treated for as long as 8 months with an injection that's given once a week. And during that period of time, the blood sugar does not go above 100, nor does it go below 60. And the mice seem to live happily thereafter. I was going to show you a video of these happy mice, but I was unable to do that, which would have been the highlight of the program in any case. And also you can see this was their hemoglobin A1C and how they normalized the hemoglobin A1C down to about 5.7 or less. So hyperglucagonemia. The liver, this is the key point, without glucagon, if you deprive it of glucagon, cannot produce enough glucose to exceed the glucose consumption of the brain. It seems to be able to produce enough glucose to satisfy the brain and the central nervous system, but it cannot overproduce without glucagon. Type 1 diabetic rodents treated with glucagon receptor antibody completely normalizes hyperglycemia. It restores the hemoglobin A1C to completely normal below 5.6%, and all of that is done without insulin. Dr. Roger Unger, our guest tonight, said, and I quote him here, "We know for certain that diabetes cannot exist without hyperglucagonemia." Can this treatment be used in humans? Well, we were given insulin. If we deprive you of insulin, can you live a normal life? Lifetime without insulin could have unexpected consequences. We're not sure about that one. Perhaps a token dose of insulin should be given. In other words, even if we could normalize the blood sugar without glucagon, with glucagon suppression without insulin, Dr. Unger suggests maybe we ought to, if we could do all this, give you back some insulin, a token dose of insulin, 5 units of insulin or something. One of the possible problems of excess glycogen, and one possible problem with suppression of glucagon might be, one area of concern would be what's called excess glycogen deposition in the liver. And that is a possible concern. So, I just want to show you this picture. This is a picture of Dr. Charles Best, the co-discoverer of insulin. He's talking to medical students in 1970. Now, the reason why this is of some interest is I once bought a book on the discovery of insulin, and I was leafing through the book. And I came across this picture, and I said, hey, I was in I remember when Dr. Best gave that lecture. I remember going up to him, and I had this burning question in my mind. And I turned the page in the book, and somehow someone took a picture. I don't know why I didn't listen to my mother and have a haircut that day. And I can't blame my wife because I wasn't married at the time. In any case, I was actually going to, and I spoke to Dr. Best, who I subsequently got to know quite well, and I asked him, I guess it's the job's been done. There's nothing more to be done in the diabetes research area. We've discovered insulin. He said, no, we're just beginning. So there were many interesting inventions in the 1920s. The Model T Ford, flappers, the Wurlitzer, air-conditioned coats, personal air filters, personal flotation devices. But many of these inventions have come and gone, and perhaps the same will be true of insulin. Maybe one day we'll be able to take all this insulin, and we have quite a few of them to pick from. I just took these out of my fridge yesterday to take this picture, and there's quite a selection of insulins, and maybe one day we'll be able to put a year on its end. And to quote Dr. Unger, he said, 95 years since the introduction of insulin, a novel and far superior therapeutic strategy involving suppression of glucagon action has emerged for patients with type 1 diabetes in mice and perhaps in men. So I remember John Steinbeck's book of Mice and Men, and maybe he was on to something. Thank you. So, again, I wanted to just remind you again what I said to Dr. Unger. I said, Dr. Unger, I'm impressed with your mice, but I treat someone with diabetes every day. And I see 25 diabetics a day. I've been doing now 39 years, and I need something new. And you got this nice mice data. When are we going to see it tried in humans? And he said, it's very frustrating here at the school. There's a lot of barriers. And I said, listen, you got barriers, you want to do some study, you can do it at my place. I have a nice place. I got lots of patients. And maybe we could work something out. So we're looking into that as a possibility. Now, there are a lot of barriers to getting studies done. I mean, when you use we have a new drug for humans. I said, why don't we do it in dogs? And I said, I have a daughter who's got a dog.
Still have to do it in humans.
Yeah. I said, what about dogs? And he said to me, but you can't do research on dogs anymore because everybody loves their dog. So my dog is safe here. I can tell them. But you still have, in any case, you still have to do it in humans. So, first of all, Dr. Unger, do you want to have anything to say? Do you want to say anything?
You get the best talk on subject. I think you should replace me in the lectures at the school.
Well, thank you. But the question will be, what do you see as the greatest barrier? What is the barrier to
the IRB?
You want to explain what that means? Here, do you want to hear a microphone?
No, I don't want to get into politics.
Yeah. We don't have to speak to Trump about this, do we? No.
You never know.
You never know. We might. There are boards that look at human studies, and they're very, very, very cautious. And I think if I listen to Dr. Unger correctly, he says there's a mindset problem, and the mindset is the dogma. The dogma is that you need insulin to treat type 1 diabetes. We've done that for 95 years. Every day I walk by the statue of Banting and Best. And to change your thinking about something so central is very, very difficult for human beings to overcome. But that's why I usually show the example of dogma, that we face dogma, we faced it before, and somehow it's a barrier. But if the evidence is good enough, as scientists, the reason why we make progress, we used to not make progress. People used to make their own decisions about how they treated people because they thought it was the right thing, but we base it on science. And when the facts change, our belief system has to change. So, and I think when Dr. Unger gave his talk, he said, the first time he said something like, I'm going to show you some data that's overwhelming. 99% of you are going to believe that insulin is central to the treatment of diabetes. And when I finish my talk, 99% of you are going to still believe that insulin is central to treating diabetes. I was 1% that was left out of that. So I am interested, and I'm going to have a chance to meet with the company that's making this product, and we're going to begin a process of seeing what it would take. And I won't feel bad if this is done somewhere else, but I would like to see it go forward. And perhaps there's a real chance. And if you show some interest in this and be one of our patients, we would like to invite that at a later date. We're not in any way recruiting people here in the slides. Any questions? Question?
What are some of the negative side effects or implications of the anti-glycogen drugs?
So, Dr. Unger, who did this research with the mice, sacrificed the mice. Marjorie, the dog that I showed you earlier, was sacrificed after God getting insulin because they wanted to take a look at what was the consequence. We're not planning on sacrificing any humans if we get to that level. But the mice have been looked at, and they've been on this drug for example, 8 months. And as far as we know, was there any problem with the mice?
Well, there's marked hyperplasia in the mice that receive the antibody to the glucagon receptor. And we worry about the possibility that there might be malignant transformation and the development of glucagonoma, which is a very, very bad disease. It's never happened. There are 3 humans that have that were born with a defect in their glucagon receptor and had no glucagon action, and they all lived into their 60s and there was no glucagonoma.
So let me interrupt for a second, because remember, if you block a receptor, what will the alpha cell try to do? It's going to try to overcome this, and therefore it will become hyperplastic, bigger, more active. Can a cell that's hyperplastic undergo a change to a neoplastic process? I have never seen a glucagonoma. Dr. Unger probably has come across one or two.
I've seen 2 of them.
You've seen 2 of them.
I don't want to see a third one.
And you want to think it's not a good cancer to deal with. So obviously this is part of the concern.
It's a very surprising syndrome, and they, two of the patients that I saw have committed suicide
Is that
because
right?
of the intractable pruritus.
Right, he had a very, very severe itch. And obviously this is one of the concerns. And all drugs are have potential problems. We don't get drugs that don't have some kind of side effect. So that would be a concern. So that was certainly one of them, yes.
Is that the reason then that there's the thought of the token insulin every now and then to try and keep that from happening, or what's the purpose of that?
Although it's hard.
Well, we don't know if you take a type 1 diabetic off of insulin for a lifetime, we don't know whether that in itself will do harm. And we don't want to find out that it's harmful. So the best we can do is give tiny doses of insulin and say that they're not completely insulin deprived. Now, the other thing about the insulin is if you're trying to suppress glucagon, insulin suppresses glucagon itself. So you don't get a good effect of a non-insulin glucagon suppressor if the insulin levels are elevated because you're giving two competing drugs and trying to assess the efficacy of one of them.
So when I was studying the anatomy in preparation for this talk, I noticed something called an umbilical vein. And remember you may not remember, but when you were born, there was this umbilicus, there was a placenta, and that placenta was sending nutrients through the umbilical vein. But if you know where the umbilical vein winds up, it winds up right in the portal circulation. It empties into the portal circulation. So I was thinking, if that umbilical vein ever remained dormant, and you gave, this is me just thinking, if you ever gave insulin, don't try this at home. If you gave it in the belly button, could you deliver insulin? And I'm sure it's obliterated, and you couldn't do this, but I was thinking, here was a conduit that goes from outside your body right to the portal vein. And if you gave 5 units of insulin, I was thinking, and I'm sure you can't do this, but if you could, you would actually be able to deliver a small amount of insulin, but not to the, that would go to the liver, that would not go to the pancreas, unfortunately. It would go to the liver. But I'm sure that vein is obliterated, after you deliver. And we couldn't, but no one has ever, I was surprised to find this umbilical vein going right into the portal vein. That was my thought. Question?
So the mice are on a pump that delivers it, right?
No, it's a single subcutaneous one injection per week.
And that was an osmotic pump.
The REM that was a pump or subcu injection?
The antibody was a single injection.
Single injection. No, the antibody.
The
somatostatin.
The leptin was
right, but the glucagon blocker was a subcu injection given weekly.
Exactly.
So were any of the mice ever stopped giving that weekly dose to be put back on insulin? Because
were any of the mice failures that it didn't work and had to be put on insulin?
But have we tried
we
to
didn't
stop?
see any failures.
There were no failures.
But we haven't stopped to see if we could go back to insulin if this doesn't work. We haven't tested the mice on it, stopped the weekly injection.
Okay, so she wanted to know, she was asking the question, if you had success with this drug, is there any reason, or did you attempt to stop the drug and go back to conventional treatment?
If we find that, if when we treat humans, if we palpate the liver every day and see it getting larger, I think we would stop the antibody and give some glucagon and maybe an SGLT2 inhibitor to kind of flush the glucose out of the body.
So it sounds like there would be alternative treatments, but obviously with this treatment in humans, there's going to be a lot of things to be watching. And certainly we don't want the liver to get enlarged from glycogen deposition, but it's so enticing the concept of being able to stop insulin that I don't think we can stop looking at this. And I want to make it clear that there are many drugs that are developed that look very good, but for their side effects never see the light of day. So the drug has to be sufficiently safe to warrant its use. So even if this theoretically could work, it may not be the right drug. But there might be other ways of blocking glucagon. I've shown you 3 drugs that did block glucagon by different mechanisms. And certainly, if this is shown, you can bet that different companies are going to come out with drugs that are going to try to attack it in a different way. That one might be better and one might be safer. But I think it needs to be answered. That can you treat type 1 diabetes safely without insulin? Question?
Is part of the problem with resistance what it would do to the existing drug manufacturers?
Okay, good question. So I showed all that the pictures of all the companies that make insulin. Dr. Unger and I will be marked men, apparently. No, but we would certainly be putting people out of business. And there is this, I think, perception that that there's vested interest in maintaining a disease. And but I think that's probably not the case. And I think that you could bet, for example, these companies will quickly be looking at ways to block glucagon also, and perhaps already are doing this also with their own drugs. So they are in the business of improving things, and it would seem they'll put insulin out of business, but it's not tomorrow. So don't throw away your insulin yet, and just keep that in mind. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
It seemed when you were showing the scale there of the mice
Yes.
and their normal blood sugar
Yes,
were somewhere in the hundreds, but that was over an 8 day.
that was only 18, but Dr. Unger, I didn't have access to that slide, which I would like to have, but he's done it for 8 months.
Right.
So it's not just
But
short-term
on
effect.
each one of those days, the very short period there, and it just shows
Yeah.
a straight line. I wondered how you fed the mice, because you.
So I concluded the treatment for diabetes is a rat diet. That might work out actually quite well. But you're saying,
If you feed the mice on an adaptative basis, in other words, you put food there and allow them to eat.
do they have a smorgasbord, these mice?
They're ad lib fed.
Ad-lib, they had ad-lib.
Ad lib fed.
Ad-lib fed.
Yeah.
So they had the buffet was
Whatever they
always
wanted.
open apparently.
Yeah,
But
the food was
humans don't eat that way.
No,
Humans eat 3 times a day,
right.
and so then you get these big peaks.
Not everybody does.
Whereas when you're feeding mice, they pretty much eat constantly.
Yeah.
No, they really only eat like at night.
There they are. The mice eat at night. And therefore they are not eating that much consistently during, they don't munch all
They
day.
don't munch all day.
They're probably sleeping much of the time in the daytime, do they? Who knows? Okay. So obviously my way of thinking about this would be that every diabetic, if we ever do this study, would be on a continuous glucose sensor, and that data would be followed electronically through the internet, and everybody would be watched. We can already do that. So for sure we would watch. We want to watch them before meals, after meals, everything. But we'll see how all this evolves over the next little while, and we'll be sure you'll all be notified of
But in
any
all our
progress.
published studies, there's diet matching of treated and untreated animals.
Yeah, so there's always a control group for all these observations.
Right.
Yeah. So it's very impressive, and if I had a mouse that had diabetes, I know exactly where it's at. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.